Hello and welcome to this late night reaction edition of the GD Politics podcast, State of the Union edition. I'm Galen Druk, and I am joined this evening with friends of the podcast, Mary Radcliffe and Nathaniel Rakich. Mary, Nathaniel, welcome to the podcast.
Welcome, Galen. Happy anniversary.
Yeah.
Yeah, happy anniversary. Okay, so we just finished watching the State of the Union address and the Democratic rebuttal, and I felt like it was an important thing for us to do together because not exactly 1 year ago tonight, but 1 year ago, the night of the State of the Union address is when we found out
joint address.
Joint address. Yeah, okay, we get it. Was when we found out that 538 was being shuttered by ABC News in a leak to the Wall Street Journal. It literally got published while Trump was speaking during his fake State of the Union address. And the three of us all then had to record a podcast together that ended up being the last episode ever recorded of the 538 Politics podcast, during which we made oblique references to the fact that it seemed like 538 was being shut down, but we ultimately hadn't been told by our bosses, so really couldn't be explicit about it, although we all pretty much saw the writing on the wall. So we are back.
Or the Wall Street Journal.
Or the Wall Street Journal. Yeah, but good one. So we are back a year later to prove that life goes on. It feels like it's been 5, but it's only been 1 year. A lot has happened. Honestly, just that speech itself feels like 5 years.
Oh my gosh.
So we're here to mark an anniversary. We're here to mark a record broken. It was the longest State of the Union address in American history. Is that right, Nathaniel?
Yes, at an hour and 48 minutes, but it wasn't 2 hours, which is what Trump and his team had been kind of teasing beforehand. And so I think they really succeeded in lowering people's expectations for the night, because people were like, wow, it wasn't 2 hours. Guys, it was still the longest State of the Union address in history. That was a freaking long speech.
Breaking his own record set last year at the fake State of the Union, right?
And there was another record broken tonight, right, Mary? You were tracking the number of shout outs to people in the audience.
Yeah, so I should caveat this because I wasn't actually tracking this live. It was partway through the speech and I was like, he seems to be naming a lot of people. So I don't have an exact count. Based on my notes and my recollection, there were at least 15 times that Trump named a guest in the audience that he had brought to the State of the Union to make a point about whatever.
It was a real Oprah Winfrey kind of moment for President Trump, where you got to be like,
congressional medals of freedom and whatever else you're doing.
And it ranged from just these out of nowhere, gruesome, gory stories of blood pouring down the aisle of a helicopter and then introducing a member of the armed services to hey, it's the USA gold medal, hockey team, let's all it was a kind of a whiplash situation.
Yeah, so that was at least 15 shout outs that I counted. When we get the full transcript, we can double check. And according to the American Presidency Project at University of California, Santa Barbara, that is a record, beating Trump's record set in his first term of 13 shout outs. I will say, on average, they've been tracking this since the first time a president shouted someone out, which was Ronald Reagan. And then Trump, in his State of the Unions, averages way more of these shout outs than any other president. In his first term, he averaged 10.5 per speech. The next closest president was Biden, whose average was 6. I should note that this does not include 2021 or 2025, because in 2021 was COVID years, so the State of the Union didn't have very many guests, and they did not have data for 2025.
So Trump, the showman, really likes to make his mark with featured guests. I mean, okay, there's a lot to get into here. It was an hour and 40-minute speech, hour 48-minute speech. I'll say my takeaway from it all was just a total lack of decorum. That's not a surprise at this point. I don't think anybody was going in expecting, some sort of, stuffy capital P presidential speech. But he was calling the Democrats sickos and they were yelling back at him. And he was like, these people are crazy. And it was not a State of the Union in the sense of this is our shared nation and this is how it's going. This thing that we're all invested in. It was much more political and campaigny than that. I'm curious for your top line takeaways if it was similar or if you had something more, I don't know, more detailed than that. But my takeaway coming out of this was just a little bit like, what the fuck was that?
Yeah, I tend to agree. I like at some point he pointed at the Democrats when he was talking about affordability and cost of living issues and said, "You caused that problem," right? Like, I mean, really felt like a lot of politicking. In fact, we were texting while we were all in our own respective homes watching the speech, and like that stuck out to all of us, right? Like, this seems like a lot of politicking. I mean, Nathaniel pointed out, and maybe you can speak more to this, Nathaniel, it seems maybe it's always been like this with Trump, and every year we're just surprised by how it continues to happen.
I think it's gotten more and more political with him. Like, yeah, I don't remember his first term all that well, but I remember that last year his speech was also a lot like this. It wasn't a traditional State of the Union. It had a lot of that showmanship. It was very political. It was obviously Trump's favorite thing in the world to do is to give a campaign speech at a rally. And this is basically him trying to approximate that with half the room being his supporters and half the room being his opponents, which I think to some extent he relishes, right? I mean, I think we talked about this last year that it was kind of like, the question time in the UK, right? Where, the president in this case gets to, go back and forth with his opposition, the Democrats. And but I think it does seem like every year it gets more and more personal and nasty, and the decorum gets thrown out the window even more. This is obviously a different type of speech, but I think like with his inaugural address too, like his inaugural address back in 2017 was like pretty dark. He talked about American carnage and stuff like that. But I think I believe we were all on the podcast together for his inaugural in 2025 as well. And I remember coming back to that being like, whoa, that was really negative, like even more negative than his 2017 address, which I rewatched after the 2025 address. And I think he has just gotten more. He has stopped sugarcoating it. Like, he still had a couple of trappings of a traditional State of the Union in this. He did have a couple of requests to Congress, which I assume we'll talk about. He ended with a very flowery thing about America's 250th and the promise of 1776, and from the sun-kissed beaches of Florida to the endless plains of the Dakotas. But for the most part, this was he was not holding back.
I mean, I think the moment that will probably get the most attention from analysts after the fact was the moment when he said, stand with me if you agree with the following statement, which was that the first duty of the American government is to protect American citizens, not illegal aliens. And so, of course, Republicans stand and applaud. I think it might be the longest applause line of the whole speech or something, or maybe it was
the hockey
team.
I think was the longest
I think it was probably the hockey. second to U.S. men's hockey, and Democrats are just sitting there sort of looking stern, not standing and applauding. And I don't know who controls the cameras, but they zoom in on Mark Kelly in particular, senator from Arizona, who's looking stern. And part of me wonders, like, I don't know, why not just stand and applaud? Like, I guess it's kind of annoying to give Trump the win, but ultimately, I don't think there's a Democrat who would any Democrat in any competitive election who would reasonably say no to that statement. And they did sort of stand and applaud at different points in time, particularly to cheer for the armed services and things like that. And so part of me wanted to say, like, it's not a big trap, just stand and agree, but I'm sure lots of Democrats disagree with his characterization of illegal aliens as opposed to undocumented immigrants or immigrants in the country illegally, or however you want to say it. And that was the moment during which Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar were shouting back at the president saying, "You're killing Americans." I mean, obviously, the contrast there is, in your pursuit of illegal immigrants, you are not keeping American citizens safe. Exhibit A, Renee Good, Exhibit B, Alex Preddy. So I understand Democrats have a lot of anger about the whole dynamic of immigration right now. But part of me also thought, why even give him those optics? Because that is going to be sort of the main image from the night for a lot.
Yeah, I mean, I think we should caveat this by saying that State of the Union addresses really don't matter politically. We as we covered at 538, right? The president typically does not get they're just as likely to get an approval rating like decrease as increase out of the speech. And these things tend to get forgotten within days. And it's not like people are going to be voting in the midterms based on this or whatever. But like, I agree. It was a lose-lose proposition for Democrats. It was either like give Trump his win and basically like grovel before him, or like have this pretty bad like look of, like that can be in a campaign ad. And again, I'm not sure that that's going to matter given all the noise that's going to surround the 2026 midterms. But yeah, it didn't look good. But I thought it was a really interesting kind of like perversion of this. I think speaking of kind of the way that the State of the Union address has become, particularly under Trump, has become kind of campaignified and politicized, is that, this is obviously a feature of State of the Union addresses, is that, every so often it gets interrupted by applause, and usually the president's party claps and the opposition party doesn't. And this was the president like almost like breaking the fourth wall and being like, I am going to dare you to not applaud for this right now, and like really bringing attention to the fact that the Democrats were not applauding something that should be to your point, Gil, and I think that like 99% of politicians would agree with. So yeah, it was a smart play, but also one that was, I think, really perverted the nature of the exercise, of the democratic exercise of the State of the Union.
And he kind of did that again and again, being like, look at these guys, they're not, for gender transitioning, for example, he did a shout out to somebody in the audience who, had ultimately not transitioned and was going, and then had a full ride to Liberty University, and was like, and then he said, like, these people are crazy, everyone should be standing, applaud, whatever, that kind of thing.
I mean, thinking of it as a lose-lose proposition for Democrats, like you said, Nathaniel, it really reminds me of the 2020 Democratic presidential debates, where the moderators of the debates did all these raise your hand if you believe yada yada statements, like raise your hand if you believe we should have Medicare for all, like whatever it was.
Decriminalize crossing the border.
Exactly. Like whatever, and whatever statement comes next, like for a lot of those candidates, it really is a lose-lose proposition whether you raise your hand or don't. Because there's like a part of the base, a significant part of the Democratic base that supported those positions, but not necessarily among the general electorate. And that's really what this reminded me of, is like, you're putting yourself in a position that's hard to defend in either case.
And to put a finer point on it, any Democrat that stood and applauded for that speech would have become immediately persona non grata among Democratic primary voters.
For sure.
It would either have to be one of those things where everybody decides we're just not going to give him this win and everybody stands up. Or nobody stands up, because
and nobody wanted
if
to be the
Mark
one person
Kelly
who did it.
stands
up all by himself,
right. But I mean, it was really a moment designed to be clipped and played over and over again on Fox News.
Okay, so we won't fall any further into the trap, although it was a politically savvy trap, I guess, is what we're saying. Let's talk a little bit about what the point of the State of the Union often is, which is to set out an agenda going forward and ask Congress to do the things that you as president would like them to do at the start of the year, right? I guess the other thing is to whether or not the State of the Union is strong. And in Trump's estimation, the State of the Union is strong. He said those words explicitly.
It's really funny. The State of the Union is always strong. It's crazy how that's the case.
Hey, even Abigail Spanberger agreed.
Don't you remember back in the day, though, when Obama couldn't say that the State of the Union was strong? He had to say it was getting stronger because it didn't feel like the recovery had really sort of
was
caught
that like 09
fire
or 10?
yet.
Yeah.
That like awkward moment where it's like, is he going to say that it's strong because Americans don't feel like it's strong? He's got to just say it's getting stronger. But I mean, it was notable to me, at least, that the first time he asked for congressional action, it was to codify something that he'd already done through executive action. And the second time he asked Congress to act was also to codify something that he'd already done with executive action. The first being favored nations prescription. So, lowering prescription drug prices to be in line with or lower what other countries pay. And this is in particular, we can talk a little bit more about this on, like weight loss drugs and things like that. And then codifying private equity firms not buying private homes on the American sort of real estate market, which are things that he's already attempted to do through executive action. I don't know. Did you have any thoughts about how much he did or didn't ask Congress to do?
Very much so. Yeah. So as you point out, traditionally, the point of the State of the Union is to go to Congress and say, hey, pass my agenda. And to that end, parapolitical scientists Donna Huffman and Allison Howard have collected data on how many requests the president has made in State of the Union addresses over time. And
is that Mary drinking whiskey right now?
Oh, yeah. But I stayed sober through that hour and 40 minutes for you, Galen. I am drinking scotch.
No,
Now
the
you're
real
gonna-
play was to drink during the speech. That's what I
You
did.
didn't warn us, Mary. I would have gotten something myself.
Okay, I'm sorry. Carry on, Nathaniel.
No, it's okay. It's for a good cause. Anyway, so the median State of the Union between 1965 and 2024 had 31 asks in it, congressional requests by the president for Congress to take action on something. Now, Trump has always been below average on that. During his first term, he never surpassed 24 requests for congressional action, but I was keeping an informal tally this time around, and I don't know exactly what the political scientists kind of methodology is, but I only counted 5. And I think that's just extremely telling because, as we have talked about on this podcast, Donald Trump has taken an unprecedented number of executive orders, I should say. He has obviously tried to consolidate power in the executive branch more than any other president has, and has basically not had any use for Congress. He also said at one point, and I quote, "Congressional action will not be necessary," when talking about the tariffs, which is just a bonkers thing to say at a State of the Union address, which is, it's supposed to be the point, is congressional action. And so I just thought that was a really interesting and kind of era-defining kind of stat from the speech.
Can I ask you, Nathaniel, because you have that informal tally, one of the things that I was noticing is what you typically get from a State of the Union address is not just asking Congress for things, but also announcing new policy ideas.
Yes.
Hey, here are my new things I'm thinking about that I would like to bring before Congress and negotiate over. And when he's talking about this stuff, like we mentioned, several of these were asking to codify stuff he's already done. He asked Congress to pass the SAVE Act and to block congressional insider trading. These are all bills that are already being either moved through or not moved through the legislature, but already have been introduced. Did you notice any new pieces of legislation we had not heard about before?
So he didn't. I mean, I was kind of careful, and this is part of why I mentioned that, I don't know exactly the methodology that the political scientists use, but he did talk about some proposals of his. So he had a healthcare proposal and stuff like that, but he didn't specifically say, "Hey, Congress, pass this," so I didn't count it.
Okay.
And so,
And
obviously,
also,
again, this president has taken a lot of executive orders. Maybe he's just being "Hey, FYI, Congress, I think this is a great idea. I'm going to go and do it myself. Congressional action is not necessary." Again, talked about the tariffs in that way. So it was a lot of talking about his accomplishments, which were kind of Congress was ancillary for.
Yeah, because that's, for me, listening to this speech, one of the things that really struck me is it really felt like there was nothing new here, right? And that is atypical for a State of the Union address. This felt more like a rally speech where it's just you do the same shtick over and over and over again. And this is the shtick that Donald Trump does. And so he did it some more, but just on a nationally televised speech. And I guess I felt like that was really bizarre to me. There were only 1 or 2 things in there that I had not heard anything about.
Right.
And I just felt like it didn't seem like there was a purpose to this.
And it was small. One thing that stuck out to me as something that I hadn't heard before, but maybe it's already been offered, was Delilah's Law, where he shouted out another person in the audience, and he talked about, wanting to pass a law that bars states from providing commercial driver's licenses to people in the country illegally.
Oh, you hadn't heard about that?
So maybe that's already out there, but, he implores Congress to take that action. Okay, that's all well and good. But when you think about what are Americans most concerned about, we were all watching different networks going into the speech. Literally, 17,000 times before the speech begins, you hear the anchors and the analysts talking about affordability. What is he going to say about affordability? And so he opens the speech and he lies and he says inflation is down to 1.7%. And he ticks off all of these accomplishments on, the cost of living, inflation, tariffs. We ended DEI. We've seen a decrease in crime, which that's true. We have seen a significant decrease in crime. It started under Biden.
Stock market, oil production.
Border crossings, virtually zero. Basically true. But we don't hear any proposals on the big ticket items. He could get up there and say, he talked about no taxes on tips, no taxes on overtime, no taxes on Social Security, which all have a lot of caveats associated with them that make them less lucrative than you might initially think for the people for whom that would have an impact. But he could get up and say, and I want to pass a law saying that states can't have their own gas taxes. He can literally say whatever the fuck he wants, and everyone will talk about it the next day. And
Yeah.
if it's something that has to do with trying to make life more affordable for Americans, that's his bully pulpit. Like, that's the whole point of a bully pulpit. And he says literally nothing.
Well, so he did have a section about affordability later in the speech. And we sort of touched on this before. This is when he like pointed at the Democrats and said, "You caused that problem." He said,
What does he propose? I mean, I could have been totally
so there are a
spaced out by
couple.
then. But yeah,
There are
go
a
for
couple.
it.
Okay, yes.
I'm willing to
might
give
have
credit where credit's due.
So that was where he outlined the healthcare plan that you were talking about, which we have heard Republicans kicking around, of modifying Obamacare so that rather than providing a stipend to the insurance companies, it would provide funds directly to Americans to do as they please with, to purchase healthcare for themselves. So that was one policy. That was where he had the ask about codifying the most favored nation status for prescription drugs. He talked about this policy. This is one I actually hadn't heard about. AI companies having to produce their own so that they're not competing with Americans for energy.
That was not
but
a
it
proposal.
was not a congressional ask. That's right.
Right.
So he was saying that he's negotiating with these companies, basically having the individual companies make these like informal agreements that they will do that. But those kinds of things are not up to the federal government. Like the energy stuff is negotiated at the local level with the county and city in which you are building your project.
It's literally just the AI company saying, yes, Mr. Trump, we will create our own electricity wherever we develop our data centers.
It's them saying, we promise you. Like, it's nothing.
And that was the only mention of AI as well. I was, when we're talking about big ideas, bold, in some ways it's weird because he talked about the one area where Americans are really skeptical of AI, which is electricity prices and data centers and that whole thing. But AI is powering much of the stock market gains that he's talking about. It's kind of a success story, quote unquote, under the Trump administration, which has had a purposefully laissez-faire approach to AI with the goal of, beating China and powering the economy. So that's kind of a success story, but he doesn't actually talk about that. He does talk about the one area where there's a lot of skepticism, and he says nothing about the future.
Yeah. So there's two more things in this affordability section I want to highlight. The thing about the housing, not allowing private equity to purchase individual family homes was in that section. And this thing about access to retirement plans through the federal government for folks that don't have matching retirement plans through their employers. So those are like the policies in that section. But the thing to me
and
about
small
that,
bore stuff, like again,
yes, it's all small ball. It's all small ball. Most of these policies affect relatively few people. Like if you look at the private equity purchasing single-family homes, recent research shows that that's less than 0.5% of the housing market. It doesn't seem like that's going to impact all that many people. We talked a little bit about the most favored nation status prior to really beginning the podcast for prescription drugs, and there's really only two or three broad categories of drugs where they've been able to make significant headway in reducing costs for Americans based on this most favored nation status, because they're having to go like drug by drug. So like all of this stuff is such small ball and is not going to impact most Americans. And some of it is like, I mean, we could debate whether or not they're like good or bad policies, but what they are is little policies.
Yeah, that stuck out to me because like, Lord knows you don't have to follow through. I mean, because whether it's Trump or any other president, almost never do the requests to Congress end up passing as requested.
Not never. It's I think it's about a quarter of the time.
Okay, so
the political scientists have data on that too.
There is a real sort of, I don't know, what's 25%, a losing record.
Right.
Of
yes. Yeah.
getting these things passed.
It's
so
meant
he can
to be
really
aspirational.
He can really say anything. And he can really say anything on the issue of affordability. And he doesn't, and, to my ear, he doesn't do much, which was kind of,
How many asks did he have? 6?
5?
I counted 5.
So we get one of them?
Yeah, if the past holds. Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's interesting because, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. But at the same time, right, I think clearly Trump has made a decision that as long as he has the bully pulpit and he, if there people are only going to write one story tomorrow, he wants it to be about his successes, right? Like there was so much backward looking stuff about, all the things that he has done over the past year and honoring people for, their acts of heroism over the past year and stuff like that. And that is like, and I think that is an interesting strategy because I think that it can be successful because I think there is some risk in like overpromising and then under delivering. But then like I think there's also risk in what he did, which is that like obviously we know from the polling that like Americans are not satisfied with his job performance, right? His average approval rating is at 39% right now. I know that on various issues that, Mary, you guys track over at 50+1, the economy and even like immigration, he's underwater. And so it risks being seen as tone deaf, I think, to be like, oh, we're doing so well, but Americans don't think that. That said, there's also this trend where the audience for the State of the Union tends to be co-partisans, right? The audience it's usually Republicans who tune into Republican presidents.
Like us.
Right, exactly. But you see this every year, right? Is that when there's a Republican president, ratings are higher among Republicans and lower among Democrats, and then vice versa when a Democrat is president. And so to some extent, he was kind of preaching to the choir. But yeah, I don't know if it was the best use of the bully pulpit.
Yeah, to that point, Nathaniel and Galen, you were talking about like this opening section where he's like highlighting the perceived successes of his administration, at least to him. I was just writing them down in my notes as he went through them. The third thing he mentioned was bringing inflation down, which, as you mentioned, like he just straight up lied about the numbers. But like that's the third thing he mentioned in his successes. It's literally his worst issue other than Epstein.
Yeah.
Like if you look at the tracking that our friend Elliot Morris has using 50+1 data on his website, this is his worst issue. His approval is in the low 30s on inflation. It's astonishing to me that you would mention that right at the top as one of your like key successes, because we also know it's very common for people to watch like a small part of the speech and then just turn it off because it gets boring. Right? Like
I mean, this is part of whatever. I hate when people start to like psychoanalyze Trump the man, but it's like this is part of the world he lives in where like you tell people the information about the world that you want them to believe that they live in, and then you kind of move on. Just saying it makes it so. And if Americans are not in line with that, then obviously there will be consequences come November. But that's sort of the world that Trump has lived in for a long time. I want to talk a little bit. We all watched most of the Democratic rebuttal, so I want to talk about that as well. But were there...
The official one.
The official rebuttal.
Because there's a lot of them.
There were a lot.
From Governor of Virginia, Abigail Spanberger. But were there any other comments that we wanted to make about the actual State of the Union address before we do that?
I mean, I think there were two of the actual requests that he made of Congress, I think, were particularly interesting to me. One was the ban on insider trading, essentially, by Congress, which was basically one of like two things that Democrats actually stood up and applauded for.
Yeah, he got Elizabeth Warren on her feet.
Yeah. So I thought that was interesting. Obviously, that's something that is like would be very popular among the average American, but perhaps
when you heard the heckler who heckled him said like, "What about you?" Like,
yes, right, exactly. What about you? And yeah, I don't know who that was, but I thought that was notable, and obviously that's kind of like the platonic ideal of populism, right? And so so they're put that it'd be interesting if we actually see movement on that. First of all, and then second,
and he also chided Republicans, didn't he? He said, like,
that was kind of funny. He was like, I didn't know if you
cheering.
guys were going to stand and applaud for that one, which was kind of funny. But Trump the showman again. But the second thing that I thought was interesting, I my day job now is working for EdVoteBeat, which covers election administration, and one of his asks was to pass the Save America Act, which is this bill that would require proof of citizenship to register to vote and photo ID. And that he also was very kind of pointed. There's been a lot of talk about that, like some Republicans want to use the talking filibuster for that, which is basically like the way that the filibuster rules works right now is that like basically any senator can put in like basically like a stand in for a filibuster, and that just kind of like puts the kibosh on a bill. But they could technically make it so that people actually have to do what people think of filibustering as, which is you stand up and you just take the time on the floor and like eat up all the time to make sure that the bill can't pass. And there are Republicans who want to force Democrats to actually do that. That, of course, would waste like weeks of floor time on the Senate, which a lot of Republicans like John Thune don't want to do. But Trump specifically said, he said something like, "Get it done, John." And he also said something like, this needs to happen before anything else happens. So I think that really signaled like the importance of the election issue to Trump. Obviously, we know, and he said in the speech, that he thinks that just elections are filled with fraud and that this is the only reason that Democrats win them, which of course is not true. But with the midterms approaching, it's obviously very, it's a very pressing issue, both for Trump and for everybody if the bill ends up passing.
Yeah. And I'll just say one more thing that comes to mind while we're talking about impressions from the actual State of the Union is that he didn't really talk about AI. He also just very briefly talked about Iran.
Yes.
At a time when we all are waiting to potentially go to war with Iran. And so he didn't really make that much of a case for why we should do that or why even Congress should approve.
Yeah, but don't you think that means
that?
that there's still active negotiations going on behind the scenes that we're not privy to?
I mean, I think we are privy to the fact that there are negotiations still going on behind the scenes. But if he's already positioned so many of America's war resources around the region to put pressure on Iran. So if he wants to put pressure on Iran, another opportunity to put pressure on Iran is in the State of the Union address. But I think in part he knows Americans don't care, right? He's trying to, not that Americans don't care, period, but that Americans care significantly less than they care about the cost of all of the things in their lives and the feeling that, they've lost control over their lives.
Yeah, as a, baby of the Bush administration, one of the first State of the Unions that I watched was the 2003 address, which was literally George W. Bush devoted that entire address to making the case for going to war with Iraq. And the contrast, assuming that Trump actually does take action in Iran, which obviously he's already done once. We forgot about that, and about Venezuela, which he also mentioned. But
he talked about his friend. Did he talk about his friend Delcy Rodriguez?
Delcy Rodriguez, yes, he did. Yes, he did.
He was like our friend. He was like our new
friend
in Venezuela,
our wonderful new partner, Venezuela.
Venezuela.
Yeah. But yeah, no. If
Maduro's
if he does
number 2, our best friend.
Right. But yeah, if he does end up going to war or taking some kind of military action against Iran, I think it would be notable how much he did not bother to, again, use the power to persuade to...
I guess one thing I would highlight is my final takeaways of this. This is not political at all. This is just like an impression for me. I was repeatedly struck by how gruesome he is. When he is talking about terrible things that have happened, he's talking about the horrific floods in Texas last year that killed dozens of children. And he said, quote, "The rapid waters, nobody's ever seen anything like it." They said, "Wow, that's something." Dozens of children died. What are we doing? He's talking about blood running down the helicopter. He's describing the
concentration camps in the film. He was like the biggest concentration camps you've ever seen.
He was describing the really tragic attack on a woman in Charlotte on a metro train or something. And her parents were in the room, and I'm watching him go in detail into this disgusting, gruesome story, and her mom is just sobbing her face off. And I'm like, the graphicness and the relish that he takes in telling these graphic and gruesome stories really, really left a bad taste in my mouth, very yucky, and I don't like it.
Yeah, it's almost like, I don't think that this is necessarily the case, but it's almost like when you're reading off of a teleprompter, and you know that the words there are superlative words, but you forget that they're associated with something tragic, and you get you read them in too excited of a manner.
Yes.
I have certainly read a script in too excited of a manner before for what the content of the script actually is. So I understand that part, but it was his language relies so heavily on superlatives. And when he's talking about really horrible things, he still relies heavily on those, the greatest comeback ever. And then also the biggest concentration camps ever. And it's just what the fuck?
Yeah. And you can tell there's moments in these stories where he's also riffing, because he'll read the sentence, he'll realize it's horrific. And then he'll pause and he'll be like, "It's so terrible. It's so horrible tragedy. Wow, that's something." God, gross. Fucking gross. I don't mean to come off as prudish, right? I'm a middle-aged white woman. I listen to true crime, but from my president, no thank you.
Okay. And with that, let's talk about a very, very different speech, which was Governor of Virginia, Abigail Spanberger. She was speaking from the former House of Burgesses in Virginia, which is where I guess the representatives of Virginia met before Virginia was a state, when it was still a colony. And she set out 3 questions that she intended to ask during the speech that she gave. I think it was only about 10 minutes, maybe 12 minutes. She
Thank
asked,
you, Abigail Span.
Yes, indeed. She asked, is the president working to make life more affordable? Is the president working to make Americans safer at home and abroad? And is the president working for you? And of course, those themes were essentially, is the president working to make life more affordable? The cost of living. Is the president working to make Americans safer at home and abroad? At home, she talked a lot about immigration and the killings of Renee Good and Alex Preddy and the detentions of other people in particular. And then abroad, she talked about sort of cozying up to Putin and selling out America's economic advantages over China and yada, yada, yada. And then, is the president working for you? The focus on that was corruption and self-dealing. I think which mostly hits on the things that Democrats want to highlight, right? I think so.
I mean, I think there's also a strand that the Democratic Party keeps playing footsie with whether they want to highlight, which is like safeguarding democracy, which she didn't mention here, I think, in any detail.
Well, kind of like we get to determine the whole House of Burgesses thing. Like we get to determine
there was
our
symbolism.
Fate. Like it's up to us to determine whether we want to be ruled by tyranny or ruled by ourselves.
Right, but she didn't make like explicit types of references that we have seen from some Democrats on the protecting
like she didn't say like Trump's an
stuff.
Autocrat. And fascism is sort of afoot in America.
Right. And they're trying to steal our elections and et cetera.
Yeah.
But that's okay. I mean, that's like a strand that I think the Democrats go back and forth on whether it's a good idea to do.
Yeah. I think polling suggests that when looking at some of the other things that she did focus on, Americans care more about the other things. Yeah, Nathaniel, what did you make of the speech?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It was obviously a much more conventional speech, and I think it made sense from a messaging perspective. I think obviously it was good that it was short, both for us long-suffering journalists and just from it makes it more likely that people would watch it or parts of it, I think. I think it's interesting. Obviously, the State of the Union response has kind of a long and troubled history. It's considered to be cursed because it's just like such a hard medium to nail. My personal favorite in this category is Marco Rubio and his water bottle. And of course, now he's Secretary of State.
Is it so crazy that we still remember that?
Yeah, that was like 15 years ago.
It was like 15 years ago.
It was Obama. Yeah.
For those of us that follow politics, it is like indelibly etched in our memories that one time Marco Rubio took a drink of water, but like badly.
Yes, but there were many, many other bad.
And look how far he's come
over time. Yeah, right, exactly. Yeah, and it didn't end up hurting his career. So I think that she did she avoided. She followed the cardinal rule of State of the Union responses, which is do no harm. For a fun piece of trivia for the real nerds out there, she basically did what Bob McDonnell, her predecessor as Virginia governor did when he gave the State of the Union response in, I believe it was 2010, because he was standing from the actual House of Delegates in the actual Virginia Capitol building with an audience basically trying to simulate the State of the Union. And this is kind of what Spanberger did. She was standing, it wasn't actually in a legislative chamber. It looked like it was just kind of like a hall with there were people sitting in chairs kind of on the sides, and there was kind of like muted applause, it was 10, the sound of 10 people applauding every so often. So
flags behind her.
Right,
Which
yeah, exactly.
Gave
but it
her
was
a moment to compose herself so she didn't have to drink water.
Yes,
like a harried
which I actually think is
person.
non-ironically a good idea. But she generally did pretty well, and obviously she's somebody who is talked about as kind of like a rising star in the party. I think that the talk that she could run for president is pretty silly because she just became governor and she would have to basically spend her entire term as governor campaigning for president. But I think she could be a very viable VP pick, and I don't think she did any harm to her own prospects tonight.
Yeah, I think the bar for this kind of response is don't embarrass yourself, and she cleared it.
Congratulations.
Good job, Abigail Spanberger.
All right, well, with that, it is now significantly past midnight on the East Coast, so let's wrap it up. Let's not stay any longer than we need to, and we'll set Mary free to enjoy her whiskey without politics, the way whiskey's meant to be enjoyed.
After 2 hours worth of speeches, come on.
All right. Nathaniel, Mary, thank you so much for joining me this evening.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Galen.
Galen. Let's hope that this podcast still exists tomorrow.
Oh, yeah. I mean, let's take a moment to acknowledge how far we've all come in 1 year. Dare we say
That's true.
we're in
That's
much
true.
better places now than a year ago.
And congratulations.
Sweet
Yeah,
memories. Thank you, and
likewise.
congratulations to both of you as well.
Thank you.
With that, my name is Galen Druk. Remember to become a subscriber to this podcast at gdpolitics.com and wherever you get your podcasts. And if you want it to continue to exist, become a paid subscriber, because paid subscribers get about twice the number of episodes, access to some of the videos for the podcast. You can join our paid subscriber chat and pass along questions for us to discuss on the show. And like I said, most importantly, you ensure we can keep making a podcast like this. Also, be a friend of the pod and give us a 5-star rating wherever you listen to podcasts. Maybe even tell a friend about us. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.